Am I on? There I am. Thank you, Dave, for those kind words. For those who maybe thought I was going to share last week, I was supposed to share last week, and I didn't because there was no Sunday school, so the kids were here, and I said to Dave, I was like, I think what I have to talk about is a little heavy. And he was like, okay, I'll share. And then he went and talked about people getting heads cut off with the kids here. So I was kind of like, maybe it wasn't a big deal if I shared. But it was good that he shared because in a way it almost became like part one to what I'm going to share. He talked about suffering, and I'm going to talk about suffering as well. I'm going to continue that teaching. Basically, Dave gave a good introduction. He didn't take anything I was going to say, as some people might have thought. So I spoke about this topic last year at Morningstar. So if anybody was there, it's going to be a little similar, but I've changed a lot, added a lot. The other thing is I didn't want to talk about this. I didn't want to share about this today. I didn't want to get up here. It's going to be tough for me to get through some of this stuff. I don't care about birds like Dave does, so they don't really help. I made a joke to Dave. It's like, I hope I wake up tomorrow and I'm in a whale. It'd be nice to be like Jonah. But, we have a very small church. We're a small, close family, and this church has gone through a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. We had Ron pass away. Mark and Darlene lost their son, Marky, last year. I know that Jorge and Rihanna's son, Sebastian, passed away. JJ got up here last year and gave her testimony and talked about her miscarriage. Josiah and Halima, my nephew, Harrison. And almost 6 years ago, Anthony Masasi Jr. took his own life. So I want to talk a little bit about myself. I don't like talking about myself, but I don't want to assume what other people go through. So I'm going to talk about sort of what I go through, and hopefully you can relate. I was raised in a Christian home, but I didn't really consider myself a Christian. I had a lot of questions growing up, and it's not that I was asking questions and wasn't getting answers. I just sort of had these questions in my head, and I was like, used to lay in bed. I remember being 10 years old and think about how can God be infinite, like trying to conceive of that as a 10-year-old kid. And like a lot of the responses I would hear in church was just like, I just have to have faith, just have to have faith. So basically in my 20s, I sort of looked into it and started researching it, and in many ways it was like C.S. Lewis says that he just didn't become a Christian. It was almost like God was sort of pursuing him, and he reluctantly realized that this was the truth, and that sort of happened to me. So then I did start going to different churches, but then what happened was, like Dave talks about a lot, I got hurt real bad by different churches, and I sort of was like, you know what, forget it. And I basically went out and did what I wanted, lived in the world, had some friends. And then, like I said, almost 6 years ago now, one of my good friends, Anthony, took his own life. And I know that affected a lot of people here. He's good friends with a lot of us, his parents and his brothers in the back. Adam and myself were with him the night it happened, later that night. And when that happened, I had so much guilt for years and years and years. Like even now, I still struggle with the guilt. Like, why couldn't I stop him? And that kept me from coming back to church. Kept me for a long time. And I would just go out and try to drink my guilt away, try to talk to women, try to just do anything that made me feel good. And it just didn't help at all. It just made it worse. Wake up the next day and just feel worse. And a couple of years ago, I came back to church. I came here. And as I said, I still struggle with it, but I've realized that only God is big enough to sort of help me deal with my guilt and help me deal with my pain and help me deal with my suffering. And I imagine that a lot of other people feel like that and deal with pain and deal with suffering. And the question comes up, and this is also the biggest question that people who challenge the existence of God will ask, that if God exists, why is there suffering? Like, why doesn't he stop suffering? They call this the problem of pain, the problem of suffering. Even in popular, if you watch news at all, sometimes you'll have roundtables and they'll have people like someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson. He'll call it the problem of benevolence. That if we have this benevolent God, why is there suffering in the world? Why is the universe so painful So he says, therefore, I just don't think God exists. Sam Harris is another one that makes the rounds on the news show who just says that either God chooses not to do anything, which makes him evil, or he just doesn't have the power to do anything. Even in popular culture, in the Superman movie that came out last year, the villain says to Superman, like, if God is all good, he can't be all powerful. And if he's all powerful, he can't be all good. So again, this question faces us as Christians in our own lives, like dealing with our own suffering. How do we deal with our suffering? And then yet, these people who don't believe pose this question to us all the time. I have an atheist friend who is, I don't think anybody knows him, but I'm not going to name him, and he's just like an outspoken, vehement atheist. And he just loves trying to get people mad, Christians mad, believers mad. But at the same time, I'll try to talk to him and engage him. He's a vegan, and he loves animals, and he says just animals should not be killed, animals should not suffer. It's wrong. So I'll bring up the question, why is it wrong for animals to suffer? He just says, well, because they're innocent. I'm like, well, innocent of what? It was like, well, they don't do anything wrong. I was like, he said the word that I wanted to talk to him about. He said, animals don't do anything wrong. I was like, well, who determines what's right and wrong? And he was just like, well, it just is. He's like, do you think it's okay to torture an animal? That's usually the response always comes in a form of a question. I was like, no, I actually agree with you. I think, but what is the basis for your belief that it's wrong? Then he'll get into arguments about evolution, like, oh, we just evolved because it helps us survive. That's why we have morals. And I'm like, well, in the animal kingdom, rape is very prevalent, and it helps them propagate their species. It's like, yet we don't do that. We think it's a vile, repugnant thing, and it is. I'm like, how did one evolve one way and we then evolved a different way? It's like that makes it just arbitrary. It actually isn't right or wrong. It's just something that is in us. It's part of our evolution. So you can't really get mad when people torture animals because maybe they just evolved differently than you did. And then you usually change the subject and talk about something bad that Christians have done in the past. That's usually where they go. I like Ravi Zacharias' answer to this question. I'll try to paraphrase it, try to follow it. He says that when someone brings up this problem, when someone brings up the problem of suffering, and they say there's too much evil in the world, they also have to assume that there is good. And if you assume that there's good, you assume that there has to be a moral law. That's how we differentiate between good and bad. But if there's a moral law, there has to be a moral lawgiver. But yet when people bring up this problem, they're trying to disprove a moral lawgiver. That's the very problem of suffering they're saying. So then he says, if there is no moral lawgiver, there is no moral law. If there is no moral law, there is no good. If there is no good, there is no evil. What's the problem? So I have three responses, not just to that problem, but to the suffering that we're dealing with. And the first response is to that question is, to the question is, what is the problem of suffering? And I sort of call this who'll answer? Who'll answer this problem? Because when we're challenged on this as Christians, they have to deal with the same problem. All other belief systems, all other people have to deal with this problem of suffering. When they are suffering, how do they deal with it? How do they answer it? What is their answer? What's their solution? And in terms of people who don't believe in any type of God, what I'd say to them is the universe doesn't care. Nature doesn't care. So really there is no problem. There is no evil. There is no suffering. Yet suffering is so apparent in our life every day. Even when you don't believe in God, you suffer. I'm going to sort of read this quote from Steve Turner from a poem. It's sort of satirical, but I think it just answers. This is basically how the atheist should answer. It says, if chance be the father of all flesh, if we are just an accident, we're just an accident of nature. If chance be the father of all flesh, disaster is his rainbow in the sky. And when you hear state of emergency, sniper kills 10, people go looting, bomb blast school, it is nothing but the sound of man worshiping his maker. The atheist has no answer. What about other religions? What do they say? In Hinduism, when you ask, why do you suffer? Why am I suffering? You're told karma. Karma, karma, karma. You either did something to deserve it, if not in this life, in a previous life, which you don't even remember. But yet, you're suffering because you have bad karma. You have bad karma. It's always the response. Karma, karma, karma. In Buddhism, it's similar. It's also karma. They believe in karma. But they also say you suffer because you desire things. And not just bad desires. They want you to get rid of all desire. So if you desire to have love, you suffer when you lose that love. So if you just don't desire love, you won't suffer. If you desire a family, you're going to suffer when you lose a member of the family. So they say don't desire a family. The heart of Buddhism is to have no desires whatsoever, good or bad. In Islam, their answer is actually pretty simple. It's just the will of Allah. What they say is iradat Allah, the will of Allah. So when you say, why did this happen to me? They say, Allah's will. And what do we say as Christians? Dave brought this up last week. I'm not going to add too much. Sin. We suffer because of sin. Sin is the rejection of God. It's not just you did something, not just this little thing you did wrong. Sin is the actual rejection of God. We have rejected God. Mankind has rejected God. God is the source of all life. And in rejecting the source of life, we've brought death upon the world. You know, the Bible says that the wages of sin is death. Even in the prayer, we walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I want to bring up a quote, and I'm actually going to put this on the board. I think it's incredibly powerful, but I'll read it. This is from a man named Nabil Qureshi, who was a Muslim who converted to Christianity in 2009. And he wrote this book called No God But One, and he says this about sin. Sin against God is more than just doing something wrong. It is rebellion against the sustainer of the universe. It is the most destructive force in the cosmos, the ultimate root of every pained heart, every broken family, every pointless war, every heinous genocide. Sin spreads through generations like a malignant cancer, and it raises civilizations like a plague. The effect of sin is cataclysmic. Like taking a sledgehammer to a mirror, sin shatters the very image of God which is in us. And I just think that is just incredibly powerful, and that's what Dave talked about last week. That we have evicted God from this world. We've made it our world. So that leads to my second response, is the response of love. How do we respond to suffering? It's love. Like I said, God made this world, but it is now our world. We have basically kicked God out with our sin. Like it's a cursed, broken world, and we're cursed, broken people. But why did God allow this to happen, you might say? And one of the answers is love. God made us so that we could love him, and then we could love each other. You can't have love if you don't have choice. And sometimes you choose not to love God, or else it's meaningless. Like if we couldn't choose to reject God, then the loving God wouldn't actually be love. It'd be something else. And as this said in the quote, when we choose to reject God, it shatters the very image of God in us. And when Adam did that, he basically, evicted God from his life and evicted life. So, you try to think of if you're married, I brought this up before, you can't make someone love you because then it's not love. God can't make us love him. We have to choose to love him. And the consequences of choosing not to love him is sin, is death, because God is the source of life. Sometimes I think we have this sort of image of God, or you've been told this image of God that I don't necessarily think is right. Or at least I don't like to think of God in this way, is that a lot of times I think we think of God as being sort of above the world, and the world is sort of like this chessboard, and he's moving all the pieces around, and he's knocking some off and moving some around, moving here to do his will. And I don't think that's right based on this. It's like God has given us freedom of the will, freedom to choose. In many ways, that is a reflection of his image. We are sovereign over ourselves. We almost are little mini gods of our own life. He's given us that power, and he does not violate that. He won't come in and violate your free choices. So, a couple of weeks ago, I saw the movie Hacksaw Ridge. I don't know if anyone saw it or knows what it's about, but it's about this World War II medic named Desmond Doss. And he was what they call a conscientious objector. But what that just means is he refused to carry a gun in the war because he believed in the commandment that says, "Thou shalt not kill." But he still wanted to be in the war and be on the front lines because he thought he was fighting against the good cause. So he was a medic. So in the movie, it recounts this story of the true story of the battle in Okinawa up on the ridge. And basically, our forces got pushed back off the ridge, but there was we left all our wounded men up there, basically. And he didn't leave. He was the last one up there. And throughout the night, with no weapons, he went and saved 75 men, would drag them to the ridge, tie a rope around them, lower them down all night. And he would get one, and he would say a prayer like, "Lord, just let me save one more. Let me save one more." Did it all night with Japanese patrols, like hunting people, trying to kill him. When I was watching that, I had this sort of image popped in my head, and I sort of thought of God is like that. God's like him. That God is on this battlefield of earth that is our battlefield, and there's billions of people, and he's trying to navigate through our sin, our choices, our rejection, and just trying to like grab us and save our souls. He's fighting for us like every single day. Throughout eternity, throughout the human history, he's been fighting for us. Tossing a rope around us when he can and basically pulling us across that ridge, trying to save our souls. And sometimes to save a soul, a life is lost, but the soul is not. We had a lot of songs today about God's love. There's Bible verses. It's the one I'll quote, I think, every time I teach. I quote John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his son, Jesus Christ, to die so that he could fix that thing that we caused. He could fix that gap. He could fix what sin did. We shattered it, and God still fixed it. He still found a way. Verse that has really sort of been on my heart for the last couple of months. I'm going to read it. It's Matthew 10:29 through 31. And it's just on my heart a lot since, my nephew passed. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a cent? And yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So do not fear. You are more valuable than many sparrows. Excuse me. That leads me to my third response. I'm just giving 3. There are other answers, I think, to suffering, but I want to talk about these 3. My third response is God loves us, but then he also suffers for us and suffers with us. God became a man in Jesus Christ, and he suffered all the pain and indignation of the cross. He suffered through temptation, and he suffered and died and took on all our sins so that we then could have life. This is unique in all of history, in all other belief systems. This is unique. When I was thinking about Marky a lot, the story of Lazarus came to me, and I remember telling Darlene about it. And Jesus actually raised Lazarus from the dead, but before he did that, Jesus wept. Like he wept for Lazarus. He felt the pain of loss. He feels the pain that we go through. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he was praying to God, and he knew that the next day he was going to die. And I can't imagine like the stress he was under, like such tremendous stress. But he prayed this, and he said in Matthew 26:39, and he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. And in that moment, I just can't imagine all the things that were sort of going through his mind. Talk about like he was he he was 33, roughly 33 when he passed. I'm 35, so I'm 2 years older than Jesus was when he died. And I think about all the things that I have wanted in my life, or I do want, and not even bad things. And I think about Jesus being almost the same age as me and what he would have wanted. He was a carpenter. Would he want to just go back and sort of continue his father's business, maybe meet a lady, have a family, but it wasn't just that he suffered death and pain. He suffered the loss of just wanting good things, having a good life. He gave that all up. There's one of my favorite songs for the last couple years. It's by this band called Me Without You, and it's called A Stick, a Carrot, and a String. And I want to read just a lyric from that, and it's basically from this story. And the snake perked up when he heard you ask, if you're willing that this cup might pass. We could find our way back home, maybe start a family all our own. But does not the Father guide the Son? Not my will, but yours be done. And the snake who held the world a stick, a carrot, and a string was crushed beneath the foot of your not wanting anything. And it's hard for me to deal with, that Christ gave up everything. He gave up a good life. He was totally innocent. The innocent lamb. And he suffered so that we one day don't have to suffer. I used to have to read the Bible when I was a kid. My parents made me read the Bible, and I just used to sit there and read it and be like, this is the most boring thing in the world. And it's funny now, I read it, and some scriptures I just can't even get through, without breaking down, and that never happened as a kid. But there was one verse when Jesus is up on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that always bothered me. I just didn't understand it. I didn't understand that verse. And now I've come to realize that when Christ took on our sin, he became like us, separated from God. God who he was with for eternity. They were together for eternity in this loving relationship, and he had to sever that so that we might be saved. Sometimes I don't even want to get up early and go to work. I can't even imagine giving up in your eternal Father that you were with, like I said, for eternity, and he gave that up. He gave that up so, as I said, so that we can live. We can live with him and be with him and love him. I'm going to sort of end with just a story. I don't know if the musicians want to come up. If you ever listen to Ravi Zacharias, he tells this story a lot. It's a true story. Elie Wiesel passed away last year. He was a Holocaust survivor, and he wrote a lot of books about it. He spoke a lot about it. He passed away last year. And he wrote this book, Night, about his experience in Auschwitz. And he tells this story that daily they would have hangings in the concentration camp. They would bring out some of the prisoners and they would hang them in front of the other prisoners. And he said this would happen daily. And he says they sort of grew numb to it. But then one day, one of the people to be hanged was a young boy. He thinks maybe 11 to 13, a young Jewish boy. And when they go to hang him, they didn't adjust the weight, and he didn't die right away. And he was up there, struggling from the noose. So all of a sudden, the crowd then became sort of non-apathetic. They suddenly got angry. They were crying out. So they cried out, where is God? Where are you, God? And he said, he cried the same thing. He got into it, and he said, where are you, God? Where are you? How can this happen? Where are you, God? He said, suddenly he heard a voice, clear as day. And it said, I'm up there hanging on the gallows. Where else would I be? Now, a couple of months ago when I got the phone call from my brother about Harrison, I hung up that phone and I never yelled so loud in my life. I took a glass and threw it across my room. And I cried out to God. Why? Where are you, God? And all of a sudden I remembered this story. And And I heard God say to me, I'm right there in the womb with Harrison. Where else would I be? I just want to pray. Lord Jesus, I just want to thank you so much for what you did for us, for dying and suffering for us. I just ask that you would help us to love you more, and to love each other. We are a suffering people, God, but with your strength, we can get through and we can help each other. And just help us to know that you're right there with us. You're right there with us, suffering through all the pain, so that one day we don't have to suffer again. Amen.